Welcome back to Powered by Play. I'm Drew, and I'm a professor of theater at Chapman University in Southern California.
I'm Avery, and I'm a theatrical scenic designer. Every month on this podcast, we explore what we play, how we play, and why we play.
We believe play powers us, and that's what makes it powerful.
All right, Drew.
All right, Avery.
Press play.
This month, we live in an ocean of laws, rules, and codes of behavior. In order to understand what we can and can't do, we have to learn society's version of right and wrong, as well as how the law is a living, evolving thing. How do we do that? Through play. From the earliest instructions we get to share toys, to learning the rules of the road, to making decisions about what laws are worth resisting. We're going to talk about all of that this month. And we have a special guest who I will introduce. Special guest is my partner, Rose Angulo, and I will pass the microphone to Rose so that she can tell you a little bit about herself.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you for having me to both of you. My name is Rose, and I am an attorney. Specifically, I am a public defender. I graduated from New York University School of Law in 2008. I spent a couple of years in big law doing corporate litigation. Then I spent 6.5 years with the Federal Public Defender's Office, representing people on death row in their post-conviction proceedings. I got to spend a lot of time visiting San Quentin as well as other prisons. And for the last 7.5 years, I have been a county public defender doing everything from misdemeanors to adult felonies to juvenile delinquency from the beginning of the case all the way through trial. And I'm currently doing a writs and appeals assignment looking at racial justice laws. So I am very excited to be here and pontificate about playing law.
I'm so excited to have you here.
Well, you two, why don't we start with a little bit about childhood and how we learned about law and order. I remember as a kid playing Cops and Robbers, and Cops and Robbers, I think, is a game that my generation inherited from the previous generation. So it was basically kids chasing each other around and saying, "You're under arrest," and chasing after the person, and the so-called robber running around and trying to evade arrest and maybe making little pew, pew, pew noises at the cops as the cops chase them down. And I remember it being a game where it didn't really matter what you did. It just mattered that you were a robber and the cop was chasing you. And that was a fun little, essentially it was tag, but with this added little story element. There was also a game when I was a kid called Stop Thief, which was an electronic game, and you were trying to figure out how to create a heist that you escaped from, and the cops were after you. And so it was a hidden movement game, and you were trying to get away. Kind of like what would later become the board game Scotland Yard, where one person plays Mr. X and tries to get away from the 5 police officers that are chasing them all over London. Very similar kind of idea. And then, of course, Clue. I loved Clue when I was a kid. There was something about moving around in that mansion and collecting clues. So rather than being the murderer or being a police officer, you were one of the other people who had been invited to the mansion, and you were trying to figure out who done it. You did that by process of elimination, and you were trying to eliminate objects that other people were holding or rooms that they had in their hand or suspects. It was always a little bit strange when you yourself were the murderer and you were accusing yourself. And for example, if I played Miss Scarlet, I would say, okay, I think the murderer is Miss Scarlet, who did it with the wrench in the billiard room. And lo and behold, I accused myself, and I was in fact guilty. I don't know how that works with a storyline, but that was always pretty crazy.
Yeah.
I also remember one of my very early introductions to what is law and what is ethics, or what is the difference between something that's good and bad and lawful or not lawful, was Dungeons and Dragons and its matrix for alignment. So in Dungeons and Dragons, you drew a distinction with NPCs, non-player characters, and PCs, player characters. You drew a distinction between the continuum of law versus chaos and the continuum of good versus evil. So you could land anywhere, and then there was also a neutral on both those continua. So you could land anywhere in any one of those 9 sort of squares. For example, a mafia boss might be evil, but they were also lawful because they abided by certain codes, certain procedures, and they only had some people who were allowed to take on certain crimes or certain positions in the mafia family, and so hence lawful but evil. Similarly, Robin Hood would have been considered chaotic good. Was Robin Hood a good character? Yes, he wanted to be altruistic, he wanted to help people out, but he did not follow the law. He was chaotic. He famously robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. And so I think this kind of blew my mind when I first started playing D&D, that there were these two kind of, axes, and that something could exist anywhere on those. And I remember playing around with different characters and really leaning into alignment to see how I could make my character behave the way that their alignment said that they were to behave. So I think that was my very early experience with these kinds of questions. What about you, Rose?
I think as a kid, there was just an innate sense of justice and fairness, especially with my sister. My sister is 3 years younger than me. And I just remember as a kid always arguing, well, that's not fair. Why do the rules that my parents put on me not apply to my sister? And whenever my dad would say, well, she's younger, I would always answer, but when I was her age, those rules did apply to me. And even something as simple as neighborhood kids getting together to play kickball could often devolve into a fight over what are the rules, what are the parameters, and are people allowed to change the rules partway through the game. I went to Catholic school and we didn't have a playground. All we had was asphalt and a few painted hopscotches. And I just remember there would be, these debates on what is a fair, we didn't even have beanbags. Sometimes we would get paper towels and get them wet. And it's like, okay, well, what are you allowed to use as your marker?
Oh my
what
gosh.
counts as being on the line or out of the line? I could also go into a whole thing on Catholic schools and the 10 Commandments and really the laws that we were taught that way. But I think kids are kind of born almost with this innate sense of things should be fair. And we want to know what the rules are before we start something. I actually have a number of friends from the public defender's office and other offices that have their own children. And the ones that are married to other lawyers, it is not uncommon for them to settle sibling rivalries between their children by doing in-house trials kinds of things. I had a friend who her younger son loved to read, and they thought that he stole a library book, and they knew his little brother would take any chance to rat him out. So one of them was the judge and the prosecutor, which really isn't fair, but still. And the other was the defense attorney. And so she called the son who was being accused to the stand. And he said, no, we had this book. I didn't get it from the school library. And then his younger brother was called to the stand and actually backed him up. So they found him not guilty. So it's so silly. I also think things like being sent to the principal's office when you're a little kid is almost the first experience with authority, with rules, and with the negative consequences of breaking the rules. I remember I was always a rule follower, and getting sent to the principal's office could have been the worst thing possible. I also, as a kid, had a sense of redemption, of wanting redemption to be possible. Again, in my Catholic school, we learned about Father Boyle, who has Homeboy Industries. And I remember being in junior high and hearing these stories of gang members being redeemed. And I found this time capsule that we opened probably too early from 8th grade. And we had to say where we saw ourselves in 10 years. And I said, I want to be a lawyer. I'll be graduating from law school. And I was the only one in the class who actually did the thing that they said they were doing. And I don't even remember knowing what a lawyer was when I was in 8th grade, but I do recall having very, very strong feelings about things just not being fair and wanting to work to have redemption. As a kid, I also played fake nonprofit, where I developed a whole mock after school program that had certain rules to it. I made flyers and posters. I was already pretty nerdy back then. And strategy games, I was talking to a couple lawyers in preparation for this podcast, and they were pointing out that any sort of board games that requires strategies really teaches you to understand and exploit the interactions between rule sets in a game and how to use them to your advantage. And the last thing I'll say on this is I think some of these childhood memories or these childhood experiences have actually been used to teach children about the law. There's something called Law Day. It happens once a year nationwide in both federal and state courts. And there are law firms that will invite kids to come in, or judges that will invite kids to come into their chambers, and they'll actually use nursery rhymes and the characters in nursery rhymes to illustrate how the law works. And I think the fact that kids relate so much to nursery rhymes is in part because there's a set of rules or expectations that get broken, and then there's consequences, and then that rift has to be resolved. And so in so many senses, we really are just innately built to crave law and order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know growing up that my parents were quite strict with my older sister and me growing up, so I totally relate to the sense of my younger brother getting to get away with new things that we hadn't been able to before. And, I was still quite disobedient a lot of the time. Like, I didn't really like conforming to the things my parents wanted me to do, like sitting nice and still or not going on the computer all the time when I wanted to as a kid, to the point where when I was in school, I was like a huge rule follower and just always trying to stay on top of doing what I had been told to do. And if I accidentally broke a rule, I would immediately start crying because I was just like distraught because I just had this feeling ingrained in me of, oh no, I broke a rule, I did something wrong. Before anybody else could say anything about it, I was already just internally messed up about it and angry at myself and stuff. But other than that, I did have a good time reading like children's mystery books series. There was the New Adventures of Mary Kate and Ashley, which was a series from 1998 to 2005. And these two girls are also known as the Trenchcoat Twins. That's a tongue twister. And on the book, there's like a little circle that says, "We'll solve any crime by dinner time." And the two books of that series that I remember the most vividly was there was one about a horseback riding school, and then another one was like this near this river in Montana, and it was about the theft of some Native American artifacts. And it's so funny looking at the covers of them because I'm just imagining like, wow, how would it feel if my 10-year-old face was on the cover of some like mystery books from the 2000s? But anyway, I also read the Nancy Drew Girl Detective series, which is notably different from the original Nancy Drew series. This one was written from 2004 to 2012, and this was more through the lens of a modern teenage girl. I didn't really relate to the more older-timey ones from before that time, and I liked that the narration was kind of quirky, and it was still solving these mysteries about stolen relics, and how Nancy had to work together with her friends and her team, interview people, do like sleuthing, the verb that I learned through all of these books. And another third favorite was Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot detective, and all of the books that he partook in solving murders in the UK, or no, all of Europe. He went all over Europe. Another fun computer game that I played as a kid was Detective Barbie: The Mystery of the Carnival Keeper. Came out in 1998. It's a computer game. And the plot of this is that Ken went to a local carnival and volunteered for a disappearing magic trick, and now he can't be found. So it's up to you, the player, to locate him. And in recent years, I've actually watched playthroughs of this game again and again, and it's so funny, and it's like quite just, I would call it campy. I mean, you're exploring a cannibal, or you're exploring a carnival late at night, and you're collecting evidence, you're interviewing the different workers. It's like really creepy out there. You get to like play the carnival games, but you're completely alone in like a big, colorful carnival. Really creepy. And you have this thing called the crime computer, and the tone that she announces the title of this object is with that exact tone. She says, "The crime computer," and I love that joke. I don't know. But she uses this computer to compile the evidence and re-listen to the interviews that she had to kind of analyze. So there's that aspect of like collecting the evidence and then processing it, and the critical thinking skills that I learned as a 6-year-old playing this game.
Loved Agatha Christie when I was a kid. I remember reading And Then There Were None when I was in 7th grade. And oh my gosh, that book just absolutely blew my mind. And I devoured Agatha Christie books.
Yep.
Poirot was great. And Miss Marple was sort of quirky. And you started to get a sense of, oh, this is the world of Miss Marple. This is the world of Poirot. Poirot is like a world famous detective, and Miss Marple is like this older lady who no one would ever expect could solve a crime. And she's there and she's helping everybody out. But yeah, there's a reason that she's called the Queen of Crime and still sells so many books and has so many different adaptations and stuff. Okay, with rules, the general idea, whether they're for games or life, is that they help us all play with the same understanding. So, what is right? What is wrong? What can you expect? Rules at school, I think, are rehearsal for laws later in life. You have to abide by the bell. You have to not talk when you're not allowed to talk. When the vibe in the class is you're doing silent work or whatever it is, you have to stay in your seat unless you are given permission not to stay in your seat. You have to raise your hand if you want to say something. These are very, very early rules in education from around the turn of the century, if not earlier than that, sort of pointed toward let's develop good workers who will stay at their station in the factory and make sure that they're doing their best work, will focus, that kind of thing. And so it's still very sort of industrial. And then I also looked at the card game Flux, and amongst gamers, I think gamers have a love-hate relationship with Flux because Flux is sort of fun. I mean, it comes in all these different flavors, right? From Pirate Flux to Monty Python Flux to Christmas Flux. I mean, there are all kinds of different versions of this game, but the basic idea is that you have keepers and you have goals and you have actions. I forget what the action is called. It's been a while since I played, but the idea is you start with a couple of rules and then you play cards to create other rules, and you now have to abide by the new rules that are in place. And so, hence, Flux, because it's constantly changing. I also was thinking about the Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And this is one of those things in science fiction where a robot cannot harm another human or by inaction cause another human to be harmed. A robot must follow the directives given to it by humans unless that would conflict with rule number 1. And a robot must save itself from harm, except when doing that would conflict with rules 1 and 2. So for both of you, I think this is really interesting because it's a way to protect us from what we have created. Like, imagine if the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park could have been implanted with the laws of robotics, right?
Ugh.
And, that T-Rex wants to eat the human, but, it had a law of robotics implanted, and so it actually can't. And I think Asimov was looking forward, not looking forward like being excited about, but looking forward like anticipating a time when we might get to a space in artificial intelligence where those rules would need to be implanted in synthetic beings. So I was also thinking of that, just the idea of what are rules, why do we need them, and how do we use them? So, Rose, as someone whose life is often about rules and laws, what do you think? Why are rules important?
There's a couple of key concepts that you learn about first year of law school, and that's the idea of notice and the idea of due process. And those two things are crucial to what we call fundamental fairness. And I think it really plays out not just in formal laws, but society in general. And notice tells you what is expected and what the consequences will be. Notice refers to the idea that you have to be told or given a heads up about what the rules are, what the expectations are. So you go to school, you're in kindergarten, you don't know that you're supposed to stand in a line and follow the teacher. You don't know that you're supposed to stay seated until the teacher gives you permission to get up. You don't know that you're not supposed to grab a toy out of another child's hands, right? So notice is really something that is required so that people can adjust their behavior to societal expectations. It allows you to stay out of trouble or to choose to break the rules. It gives a sense of predictability both for yourselves and in anticipating how others around you should act or what you can generally expect. I think a lot of rules and laws are about decreasing uncertainty. We want to feel safe. We want to know how we should act. We don't want the anxiety of going into the world every single day, not knowing if we could just be arrested, not knowing if somebody else is going to hurt us unexpectedly. And then there's the notion of due process, which is what happens when you are accused of breaking the rules. A huge part of my job is helping people who are being accused of breaking the rules. And that's really important too. How do we address rifts in people's interpersonal relationships? How do we address it when people go against the social contract? So I think rules are important and desired by the majority of people because of that sense of predictability and the reduction in uncertainty, and therefore a sense of feeling in control in a huge world where we are faced with so many other people. And then I also have a quote from Aristotle where he says, at his best, man is the noblest of all animals. Separated from law and justice, he is the worst. And this kind of reminds me of reading Lord of the Flies and this notion that without rules, anyone could kill you at any time, that people will just be after their own self-interests. It's almost like a forced taking perspective of other people. It's for the laws and the rules force us to consider others' safety and others' right to be free from harm. You know, there's lots of quotes like, my right to freedom, my right to punch ends at the tip of your nose, right? Like we can have freedom in our own actions, but that has to end where somebody else's freedom is now impinged upon.
When you mentioned the Lord of the Flies, that reminded me of this YouTube video I saw once that displayed this social experiment conducted in 2001 where there were 10 boys and then 10 girls between the ages of 11 and 12. They were both placed in separate houses to live alone in for a week with no adult supervision. And then what happened next was that the boys' house was like they descended into chaos. They had food and toys scattered everywhere, no hygiene. And then the girls were cooperative, clean, had a structured approach to daily tasks. And just watching that was very interesting because it also reflects how a lot of social rules developed in society can be based on gender or where you're born or how you grew up. Like, it's not that it's not law for women to be raised in a more socially etiquette mindful way and boys to be raised in a more aggressively, proactively, confident kind of you own the world kind of way. That's kind of like an unspoken rule slash unspoken hierarchy that exists between, genders and how they're raised growing up. One thing that we do talk a lot about in games and, designing video games or games of all kinds, like the immersive kinds, even playground games, that they are governed by a set of rules that are with the original intent of being fair for everybody. And like you said, it is a good framework. It allows for predictability and strategy so that nobody is totally designed to have an unfair advantage. I remember playing relay races growing up in elementary school, and that's where every individual kid would, run through a little obstacle course and then come back and then high five their teammate, and then the next teammate would go. And then when your entire team of people all finished, we would all have to sit down and either cheer other teams or be quiet and be organized and stuff. And after these relay races were done, some of us would win, some of us would lose, but our teachers made a big deal about you now have to go shake hands with everybody else after. There was a huge, huge message about sportsmanship growing up in my elementary school where that was the biggest thing that they emphasized every single day, of whether you're cheering for your own teammates or you're cheering for the last team who's still finishing up. Everybody deserves a supportive place to play and be part of a team. And I'm glad that was part of my foundations growing up. And sportsmanship itself is another kind of set of unspoken rules. They don't write that really in professional sports things. I don't think they have a law that's you have to be a good sport, but that is a good guideline to have to indicate positive qualities in a person or in a team or in the coach and everything. There are also so many silly laws that I read about. I used to have this book that was weird laws in different states, and I don't even remember any right now, but I'm just remembering how in the past we discussed women weren't allowed to ride bicycles for a while back then, or women not being able to vote, people of color not counting as a full human in the US. And I just think about all the really silly rules that at the time the people in power were this is fair. And then now times change and we're that wasn't fair, screw that, we're changing things now. But we have to speak up in order for things to change and fight for people in power to realize that they were not being fair in the first place at all.
Yeah. And so justice becomes this living, breathing, we always have to care for it. We always have to renew it and revisit it. And yeah, I remember reading about those silly laws too, you can't put a sheep in your car on Tuesday. Silly I mean,
Exactly,
that's not
yeah,
a specific
absolutely.
one, but it was stuff like that.
Yep.
And I think when you were talking about the relay race, I was thinking about in the season 2 of Squid Game when they do the relay race and they play the kids games. And that was such an intense and memorable episode because they had to choose teammates who they think are going to be good at certain children's games that are played in Korea. And in fact, and there was a gendered aspect to one of the games too. It was a tossing stones with your knuckles and then catching them in your hand. And and it was seen as a girls' game and one that girls would be good at. And so the teams were seeking out, oh, we need a girl, we need a woman to be on our team because we know that we're going to have to play that game. And one team was all men. And there was a guy who was like, I grew up with sisters. I played this game all the time. And he was phenomenal at the game.
Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting. But relay race, high-fiving the next person, there wasn't so much high-fiving in Squid Game as you'd better get this right or they're going to shoot us kind of thing. So that was an interesting version of the relay race.
Yeah, for sure.
I love Squid Game. Talk about rules. Oh boy. All right. So from rules to the law writ large, how does the law affect us? Some things that I remember the song Just a Bill from Schoolhouse Rock. This is a Gen X thing, I'm sure, although it kind of got redone and parodied and other things. But there was a little kid who walked up to Capitol Hill, and there was a little Bill who said, I'm going to teach you how I become a law. And the journey from someone proposing something to it becoming the law, and the whole song is about that, right? And the bill starts with, I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. So he literally starts with, I'm just a bill. And eventually he gets this very nice pin with a ribbon and a nice golden sort of medallion that says law. And so he's now a law. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. I remember, very vividly. I very vividly remember the Disney short Mr. Toad, The Adventures of Mr. Toad and Ichabod Crane, and Mr. Toad going on his crazy car ride and being sentenced by the judge, and this whole thing with British judges where if they were going to sentence someone to death, they had to put a black cloth on their wig. And there were a few, I can't remember if this was in Mr. Toad, but there were a few cartoons that were like that. And oh my goodness, that was scary. And then the ride at Disneyland, also, the judge saying, guilty, guilty.
Wild.
I think that may have been my first understanding of what a judge was. And of course, the judge has the gavel. And I'm pretty sure that when kids first think about playing judge, if someone says, let's play courtroom and you're the judge, the kid's like, okay, I need my hammer, right? You need to be able to call things to order, but that gavel was really important. In high school, we read the play Antigone. So this is an all classic Greek play. It's part of the Oedipus Rex cycle. And I read the part of Creon in Antigone. So Antigone is all about whose law is supposed to be followed. Whose law is most important? For Creon, the important thing is to follow the law of the state. And if someone attacked the city of Thebes, they should not be buried with honors. Their soul should wander the earth as a ghost. And so Antigone's brother Polynices, who attacked the town, Creon says no, his body is not to be buried. And Antigone says, no, the law that we need to follow is divine law. The gods demand a burial with honors. They demand that someone not be abandoned to wander the earth, even if that person was against the city of Thebes. I read the part of Creon. When I was reading it, I have to tell both of you, his arguments really made sense to me. I think it's something about when you read a character or you play a character, you sort of have to understand why that character believes what they believe. And in Greek theater, the Greeks loved nothing more than debate. They loved putting two ideas up against each other, and that's what's going on in this play. And so to me, because I was reading Creon, Antigone seemed like a rebellious and naive young woman she made her fate. She chose to go against the law, and so her ultimate tragic end was part and parcel of the choices that she was making. Over the years, I have come to change sides and really understand that honor and kindness are what the Greeks were valuing, and that they actually wanted you to side with Antigone, that Antigone was, for lack of a better term, right, and divine law was, it overrode human law, even though Creon was the king and was supposed to hold up human law. Divine law was more important. And so Antigone's story is about her essentially dying for what was right. And that was what it meant to be a good Greek daughter and sister and even woman, that even in the face of people pushing back on you, you did what was right and you protected your family. So that was something about law writ large that I remembered when I was getting ready for this particular podcast. I thought, oh man, I remember really investing in Creon.
Amazing observations and analysis. There is a independent game by Lucas Pope called Papers, Please, that follows this theme about relationships between morals and law. And you are basically a immigration lawyer who works on this border between two cities set in a fictional totalitarian state. And this game has also sold 500,000 copies and won a ton of awards for good reason, because the tone of this is very dystopian. There's a lot of poor conditions reflected in the drab color palette and the fact that there's no music during your shift. And the government basically watches all your activities as you take people who are standing in a line, and they give you all their papers to try to go into your country. And you have to ask them to verify their identities, provide extra paperwork, and declare with a stamp of whether they're approved or denied. And you get to experience what it's like for the government to also release new regulations, which, on a day-by-day basis in this kind of warring country, the new laws are very reactionary, and they're just responses to the current political climate. And so you're in the cycle of vicious hostility because, sorry, if somebody's, face doesn't match their paperwork enough, you get to just deny them and then go about your day. And so there is this tension between the moral pathway where a lot of these people might beg you to let them pass, or they might try to bribe you, or, maybe your heartstrings are pulled and you're tempted to let them pass even though their papers don't work. So you get to navigate this tension, whether you want to just do your job correctly or rebel against the government in that way. But if you rebel too hard, they're just gonna not pay you, and you're not gonna be able to feed your family, and then you might lose your job. And I don't know, it's just very bleak and depressing, and a great illustration of what it's like to kind of be this ultimate judge of whether somebody gets to, see their family or find their new home or something. And I think games are a great they're a great genre to explore the law and justice and morality relationship, because you get to kind of experience these emotional lessons without literally becoming an immigration lawyer, but you get to be in the shoes of the people who are trying to immigrate, as well as the shoes of the lawyers who are kind of the toys and tools of the government.
Yeah, I also think of puzzles, ethical puzzles like the trolley problem, and how those help us work out these ethical questions or legal questions. There's also the, in Les Mis, there's the question of should Valjean be pursued by Javert based on what Valjean did, right? He stole a loaf of bread. And so now Valjean is like, I will pursue you. I will follow the stars. I'm singing a lot in this episode. My apologies, listeners.
That's very accurate.
So there's this question in Les Mis about how far do you go with the law? Is it really the best use of Javert's time to pursue Valjean for years and years and years? Or are there other things that maybe Valjean could be doing that are more important? So these stories or ethical questions, I think, are fun ways to sort of rehearse what exactly do we mean by what is just, what is good, what is right, what is moral. And speaking of Valjean and the police, okay. Who are the police? How do they fit in our world? Who are the people who are out there enforcing the laws? Okay. A few thoughts here. When I was a kid, we had McGruff the crime dog. And McGruff was all about help out the police when you see them. If you're ever in a situation where you need help, the police will help you. And so McGruff was all about, hey, we're here for you. And it's, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man thing. It's kind of like your friendly neighborhood police officer. Today we have the Paw Patrol. So these are a whole group of police dogs who are helping each other out and teaching kids what the right thing to do is and how the dogs are helping enforce the laws or enforce rules. And I think as we get older, we start to see the police possibly in a different way. I'm thinking of reality shows like Cops, where you're there for a ride along and you kind of have like a ringside seat, and the cops are always in the right, as far as I can remember. I can't remember an episode of Cops or one of those shows where they're doing something wrong, but you are there riding along with the cops as they keep you safe, as they bust the bad guys. And then also, this is kind of a strange tangent, but I wonder where we got the kind of sexy police uniform, whether it's like a Halloween thing or in a bachelorette party or a bachelor party, or I'm thinking also of Beyonce's video for If I Were a Boy, where her police uniform is very different from the guy that she's with, who ends up being, spoiler alert, Beyonce music video, spoiler alert, who ends up being the actual police officer. She's kind of like imagining herself as a police officer. But if you look at her outfit, it's quite different than his. And I don't exactly know where the sexualization of police officers came from. I think it may have something to do, we'll talk about incarceration or getting in trouble a little bit later on in this episode. But I think at some point, maybe in college, maybe in high school, there's this, I don't want to say switch that turns on, but there's sort of a new framework for sexualizing police officers, along with other kinds of professions like nurses, for example. And I don't know. I just thought that I would throw that out there as kind of how is this a new level of play? So, Rose, what do you think about policing and how it fits into what we've been talking about?
Well, I love that you quoted Les Mis. It is my favorite musical, and I think I really resonate with it because it does explore these notions of what is legal and illegal, and does that match what is moral and immoral, and is the one enforcing the laws and living by the letter of the law actually the one with the moral high ground, justice and mercy, and where do they meet? So many things that I love, and 24601 becomes like this badge of honor. So playing the police, I think I remember as a kid being very excited if a police officer came to our school and brought their police car. There was even a police car that could talk, and the officers would open the doors and let you explore inside the police car. And they would give out these little sticker badges, which officers still have. The Orange County Sheriff's Department actually has these little mini stuffed animal canine police officer, these little dogs, and they're designed to look like police dogs. They're very cute. And yet they mask the history of canine dogs, which were slave patrol dogs actually sent after enslaved people who had escaped to attack them. And that is the history of the canine police dog. And to this day, they are still disproportionately deployed against Black men. But you don't get that when you have a cute little stuffed German Shepherd with a little badge. Children aren't told that history when they're given these little stuffed animals. They don't tell you. I didn't know until recently that police forces came out of slave patrols. That's the very first police forces started as patrols to capture enslaved people. And so much of this history is masked. It's a good thing you guys don't get federal funding for this podcast, because it would probably be withdrawn by my statements right now. But one of the interesting things that I like to ask is, who polices the police? I like to joke that as a public defender, I am law enforcement, but instead of, just enforcing the measly state penal code, I actually enforce the founding document, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. There are a lot of ways that I think the public tries to participate in policing. You have Neighborhood Watch. You have now with the Ring app and the Nextdoor app, you have people kind of watching out for each other. And to be fair, I think keeping ourselves safe, I understand that desire. I want to feel safe myself. I don't advocate, just lawlessness. But that's a mixed bag, right? Whenever you let people kind of play the police, including police. And I will say that I think police officers do develop a persona of police. During the pandemic, when the county was mandating masks, the people not wearing masks in the hallways of the courthouse were often the police officers. My first quarantine was because I got exposed to COVID from a police officer who wasn't following the laws. So I will say, in many senses, people who enter into the police department, some of them are very brave. They do risk their lives. I don't want to undermine that. They put themselves in harm's way to keep society safe. And yet there are people who are self-selecting to that role because they do want the power that comes with it, and not necessarily because they actually believe the law is just this worthy cause, because they're not following it in their own lives. And so when we're talking about playing police, I do think police officers themselves are in many ways playing police. There's programs designed to get the next generation of police officers out there. There's the Explorers programs, there's ride-alongs, there's a Citizens Academy that many police departments have, where regular citizens can, for 8 weeks, go and learn about their forensics, learn about their investigations, hear from their detectives, learn about their protocols. And I think those can be valuable. There's also, I think, in playing police, we can't ignore vigilantes and vigilantism. I was in high school during, I think it was Prop 187. It was looking at immigration and some stuff like that. And I remember the movement of the Minutemen in Orange County, where people would gather together and go in groups to patrol the border, would go and try to do citizens arrests of people coming into the United States. I even had a case in Orange County of a citizen's arrest from a guy who was in line at Best Buy when he saw somebody stealing headphones and then was trying to run out of the store. It's something that would have, it was like $14 or $15 pair of headphones that would have just been a misdemeanor shoplifting. But the guy wanted to be, you know, a hero and stop it, and led into injuries and led into all sorts of stuff. In some ways, ironically, I understand the desire for vigilante justice when it comes to, you know, your child is hurt by someone or a loved one is hurt or assaulted. Like, I do kind of almost understand that natural desire to take vengeance, which is probably part of why we have the law in the first place, right? Going to back to like, why do we have rules? And I think it's because as humans, we are emotional beings. We have characteristics innate to being human where emotion leads us to act. And without the law guaranteeing justice, guaranteeing accountability, I think we would feel more pressure or justification into taking the law into our own hands. I feel like I'm almost kind of contradicting myself, but this goes back to what I was saying before, the conversation I have with my students about always needing to balance the desire for accountability, the desire for justice with the desire to not have arbitrary enforcement of the laws. There's a quote by Brian Stevenson, who's an amazing lawyer who runs the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. And he says, no one is defined by the worst thing we've ever done. And I think none of us want to be defined by our failings in our own life. And yet it's so easy to define criminals by the worst things that they've done or just by their act. And so in terms of where officers fit into our world, I think they have an important role. They have a brave role. And they have a role that lends itself to corruption. The quote, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think it does take a special kind of person who can go in that role and really work towards de-escalation. And there are a lot of great police officers who are able to balance that. And then I think too, cultures develop. The blue code of silence. There's norms and practices that develop within the police force that allows bad behavior to be hidden. So policing is necessary, I think, at least in our society. It can keep people safe, and yet it can ironically be its own source of danger.
Absolutely. Whether you're a vigilante or a police officer, there's that narrative of heroism, loyalty, and protection that you're meant to be giving to the people that you care about. One of the shows that I watched a lot growing up was Brooklyn Nine-Nine, created by Michael Schur, who also created Parks and Rec, The Good Place, and The Office, and such. And Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a very popular sitcom in a police station where all these characters are solving crimes, but there's also a ton of office hijinks and some romance as well. And it's a very relatable show because it has all these aspects with like the office job parts that turn the role of police officer into the role of just another job. And this video essayist on YouTube called Skip Intro has done a really interesting series called Copaganda on YouTube, where he dissects different like media portrayals of police and explains how explains whether or not they are radical enough to really send good messages about the police or good messages that are just trying to make them seem better than they really are in reality. And Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a rather progressive show. There's a very diverse cast with several canonically queer characters. It addresses and apologizes for systemic policing problems, with mentioning constantly how there's an openly gay captain, but how stop and frisk is wrong. They also focus on the modern prison system for a few episodes and even address racial profiling. But overall, the show still softens the image of the police and does advocate for minor changes while not wanting to ruffle any feathers or suggest or enact or portray any radical change of the system altogether. And it's kind of an example of a show that gives like small solutions to big problems of a broken system that actually needs big solutions to these big problems. And Brooklyn Nine-Nine does try to model an ideal cop and community relationship, but overall it just kind of portrays a pleasant version of the police institution and the tradition with it. And I think the thing about kind of policing is that like there is this huge institution and tradition of it that indicates all these status quo and power structures that live within it and breathe within it, to the point where if we want to make anything better, we have to have completely different systems in place rather than just give all the cops and detectives all the power.
Yeah, it is a really interesting show. I enjoyed it so much when it was on, and I agree that it's kind of putting casting kind of an impressionist haze or something like that over what you actually face when you're a cop, whether you're in leadership or you're on the beat or you're a detective, whatever it is that you're doing. But it was an interesting counter to things like, The Shield or Law and Order or something like that, where the cops were very much kind of, we're going to hunt you down sort of thing. Let's look at the flip side. Let's look at criminals. Who is breaking the law? And how do we play through breaking the law? I'll start with some games, and these are games that ask us to play a criminal, whether it's, I mentioned Stop Thief kind of at the beginning of this episode, and doing a heist, trying to get in and get out, get something, or break something. It just depends on what the particular game is. Or an infiltration, trying to get to the center of operations and shut things down. Other things like that. I think of, oh my goodness, so many Star Wars games that are about the rebels trying to take down some Imperial stronghold or do something to kind of shake up the grip that the Imperials have on power. And then I'll call out a couple of card games. One is Netrunner and one is Doomtown. Let's start with Netrunner. Netrunner is a game where there are two sides that have very, very different goals. One is the corporation and one is the runner. And the corporation is trying to advance agendas that it has. And you can look at the corporation and say, are they the bad guys? Like, what exactly are these agendas trying to do? But the other side is the runners, and the three factions in the newest version of Netrunner. There was a version back in the 90s, but then Fantasy Flight Games took it over about, I want to say like 15 years ago, something like that. And now there is a fan-created extension of that. And so the three factions for the runners are the criminals, the anarchs, and the shapers. And they are all trying to do different things. The criminals are just trying to get money, straight up. And so whatever they can do to steal things from the corporations, they're doing that. The anarchs, like the Joker in Batman The Dark Knight, are just trying to watch the world burn. They're trying to just disrupt everything and just take down the corporation just for the sake of taking down the corporation. The shapers are trying to use the corporations for their own ends. They are trying to create hardware and software that would allow them to profit from what the corporations are doing. And so all three of these factions, you can see, I suppose traditionally, would be seen as the bad guys. The corporations are legitimate and they are doing work that is, I guess, within the bounds of the law, and the runners are trying to disrupt that. Then there's Doomtown. All right, so Doomtown is set in the weird Wild West that has steampunky sort of machines and gadgets, and it also has magic. It has blessed magic, it has shamanistic magic from the Native American characters, and it has dark magic from the characters who are like, calling up dark forces and stuff like that. So who are the good guys in Doomtown? There is a faction called the Law Dogs, and they are your traditional kind of sheriff and deputies. And then there's a faction that's the Outlaws. In the original factions, they were known as the Sloan Gang. So these are the, ride into town and rob a bank kind of faction like that. And then there is a faction that is the Oddities of Nature, or the Circus faction. They're the ones with the dark magic in the original sets. And then there is a group that is like the evil cattle ranchers and landowners. So here, think of something like There Will Be Blood, right? Or anything where you have the landowners who are trying to take over land illegally. So, in other words, there's no one who's really good, quote unquote. Even the Law Dogs have judges who are like, I'm obviously the judge who's gonna, find everyone guilty. And that's kind of how the Law Dogs operate. They slap warrants on people and they make arrests because they can. And so, like the Wild West itself, kind of in our imagination or a little bit in history, the laws were flexible, right? The laws were sort of gray areas. And so when you're playing these games, you're sort of thinking, not so much am I a good character, but what is my objective and what am I willing to do to get it? So, playing criminal. What do you think, Rose?
When I think of playing criminal, one thing that comes to mind is the popularity of murder mystery parties. And when you're being handed out your characters, there's the, am I going to be the one that winds up being the killer? What would that mean? And you're kind of embodying playing out these different roles. Like, okay, am I going to be a witness? Am I just going to be a bystander? And kind of seeing what it would feel like to be that character. Even little card games. I remember playing Mafia as a kid in youth group where we would be on bus trips, and it's that card game. I don't totally remember all the rules, but I just remember one person is like a killer and you have to select who you're going to kill. And just, it kind of allows you to have this little experience of, even though it's just a game, your actions can cause another player to be out of the game in some sort of ways. And what does that feel like to have that responsibility or that power? First person shooter games, video games, all of those things kind of let us play with a little bit what it might be like to do harm to another person. And I wonder if there's something about playing criminal that alleviates guilt for the things that we do in our own life that hurt other people. Because by comparison, the things we're doing in the game are so much worse, right? I don't need to feel so bad that I, flicked my sister in the arm after my parents told us to keep our hands to ourselves when, my character is doing something really, really bad. I also think that playing criminal, there's all sorts of movies in which actors play criminals where they play real life criminals. We need to look at what tropes there are. The first movie ever screened at the White House is Birth of the Nation, in which a white actor wore blackface to play a character who was going after a white woman and trying to sexually assault her, and she winds up jumping to her death, killing herself rather than being subjected to this, and things like that. Who do we think of as criminals? What is our history of quote unquote playing or choosing actors to play criminals? How are they being portrayed? And are they being portrayed as complex wholes or being reduced to this two-dimensional stereotype? Kind of on the flip side, one thing that I, as somebody who has spent a lot of time with clients visiting people on death row who once they were in prison and had structure never committed another crime, or I mean there are people that wind up getting new cases because of things that happen in prison. But part of my job was to be locked in a cell. Like literally the guards would bring out my clients in handcuffs, bring them into the cell. The cell had it looked like a mailbox slot, like the kind that goes into a house, but it was a handcuff slot. So they would put my client in the little cage and then unhandcuff them and then re-handcuff them, open the door to let me in, lock the door, and then my client would have to hold up their hands to that little mailbox slot and they would uncuff them again. And of course we had to sign waivers. And there's this big, like safety show, and some of it is necessary, but in those experiences, I was able to, some clients I had for 7 years, or I've known people for 10 years and really gotten to know them on a much more personal level and have gotten to share some of my life with them. Whenever I would go up to San Quentin, it was my job to, well, it wasn't actually my job, but one of the customs we did is to bring a bunch of coins because there was vending machines that had hamburgers and French fries. There was these frozen big as burgers, AZ, and there was a microwave there. And I was like playing waitress, literally going, heating them up, taking my clients' orders, going and getting them sodas, getting them popcorn, sharing a bag of popcorn with a client where our fingers are kind of bumping into each other as we're grabbing this popcorn out. And so I really got to see different aspects of people. And yet some of their stories were on America's Most Wanted or on these portrayals, and the portrayals and the reenactments of their crime, I mean, captured certain things and certain events, but nowhere near the complex whole of the person. I also really am interested in the notion of quote unquote criminals playing non-criminals. For example, theater in prison. There are theater troupes that will go and have the inmates put on plays. One of my own clients wrote a play while he was on death row. When I was doing juvenile delinquency, there was a theater group called the Young Americans, and they would go to different juvenile halls and spend 2 weeks in the summer helping the kids write monologues and perform songs and do dances. And they actually got to do a performance at the Segerstrom in one of the smaller theaters, and all of the judges came and the lawyers and bailiffs, and we got to see a different aspect of these kids. And so many of the kids talked about how this was the first time in their life they got recognized for something positive, or they had fun while being sober. And the next week in court, it was different. The judge in my courtroom would say, "Oh, hey, so-and-so, I had no idea you had such a marvelous voice." And so instead of the first thing being brought up is, "Oh, did you smoke weed again? Oh, did you break the terms?" It was recognizing this deeper, creative, beautiful aspect of our clients. So I think that's kind of the flip side, is people that we see as criminals being put into a different context. So I think that's probably all I have to say on that topic. Avery, what are your thoughts?
There is an interesting distinction in narration and media about criminals and villains. For example, there's like the baddie of the week versus the overarching evil villain of the entire overarching plot. One example is in the movie adaptation of Nimona. Ballister Boldheart he's basically, I mean, he's an example of like inclusive hiring, basically. Like he is about to be knighted before the queen, and then he's framed to be killing the queen, and he has to work together with Nimona to kind of break into places and gather evidence to clear his name. And in the midst of this, of course, it looks like he's committing crimes because, breaking, entering, stealing, trickery, and whatnot. And of course, he's a wanted man. And he is framed as a criminal by society because of this crime that he supposedly committed. But once he reveals the true villain of the story, which is the director who was the one who framed him in the first place, now the narrative is able to recognize that he's not the true villain. And I think a lot of kind of stories do this, like, I don't know, in Teen Titans, like every single episode has like a different bad guy, but Slade is the overarching one for one season, or Raven's evil demonic dad is like the overarching baddie in another one. And I think that also reminds me of like police work and criminality, in that sure, the police individually can be corrupt and make bad decisions, but also the system that allows them to do that is the villain in itself. And another example of playing criminals is in open world role playing games such as Red Dead Redemption 2 or Grand Theft Auto, which I've mentioned a lot because they're a lot of fun to play and they keep coming back on this podcast. But in Red Dead Redemption, you are like a cowboy basically on the run with your crew of other cowboys, and you get the options of being an honorable guy and like killing innocent people or robbing innocent people, or you can kind of be more honorable and not do as much of that. And a funny joke that I like to tell myself while playing is that if you commit enough crimes in a certain area, then the authorities mark you as a wanted man. And then when you go on your map, you see like the area that you're wanted in, like outlined in red, and you have to either like pay a fee to get rid of that or kind of like wait enough time or whatever. But just the word wanted. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm wanted? You want me? That's so cool. And like you feel kind of important as a criminal. I don't know. But yeah, it's the fun part about playing that cowboy, horsey, lovely, cute little game with a lot of crime and violence. But yeah.
Okay. From criminal to the case in court. Playing lawyer, playing judge. What happens when you are in the courtroom? A couple of things stand out here. Rose and I were listening to a podcast about Julius Caesar and his childhood. And the historian who was talking about the podcast talked about how boys, and specifically boys in ancient Rome, would go to the kind of houses of the law and houses of debate, and they would watch their fathers argue, they would watch their fathers legislate. And then the boys who would stand sometimes in the back or sometimes outside the building would imitate the motions that their fathers were making. Like if they were making a point, they might sort of hold their fist in the air or something like that. The boys would also imitate their fathers' voices when their fathers were arguing about something or creating law. This was fascinating. I mean, just the idea of Aristotle's whole thing is that we learn through mimesis, right? That we learn by copying what we see people do. This has to do with how a baby learns language, how a baby duck learns to walk by following its mother and imitating its mother, all these different things. And so here is some Roman learning through imitation. And a lot of, I think, what we're talking about today is who are we imitating and how are we trading those roles, and how do we feel when we are walking in somebody's shoes versus somebody else. And then in terms of the jury trial, the first thing that I thought of was one of my favorite plays ever and one of my favorite movies ever, which is 12 Angry Men. the genre of courtroom drama is huge, and mostly it's about the case, Inherit the Wind, and all the and Witness for the Prosecution by, again, the wonderful Agatha Christie, and all kinds of different courtroom dramas. 12 Angry Men, which is changed typically to 12 Angry Jurors today to make it more inclusive and allow for inclusive casting, takes place entirely in the jury room and roughly in real time. There's one juror who calls upon the others to reconsider their initial guilty verdicts. So there's one holdout, and everyone else is convinced that the boy who is accused of committing the crime is guilty, and they're ready to sentence him. Well, they don't sentence him, but they're ready to find him guilty and then have the rest of their afternoon free, right? But this one juror, he actually does not believe that the defendant is innocent. He believes that the prosecutor has not made the case fully, and also that the defense attorney did not do their job properly. And so the juror in the jury room basically takes the place of the defense attorney and re-argues the case with all of the other jurors. And even though this is decades old, I won't spoil the ending, but the idea of how is a jury supposed to function. And our Justice Sonia Sotomayor has said that this was one of the plays that really affected her when she was first understanding what it meant to be a lawyer and what it meant to be a judge, and she still remembers this particular play. So there you go, folks. Plays matter. I must bring up the TV show Jury Duty, which was, I think, just an absolutely brilliant reality experiment where there was they conducted a trial, but it was a fictional trial with actors playing the judge, the witnesses, the lawyers, the bailiff, the court clerk, the court reporter, everyone, and all of the jury members except one. And that sole jury member was the only quote unquote real person in the entire endeavor. And so the reality show was trying to, and the jury was sequestered in a hotel, and there were all kinds of hijinks. I mean, the trial kind of spiraled out of control. And then the discussions in the jury room, and of course the one real person was made the foreperson of the jury. All these questions about, was he going to see through this act? Was he going to realize that this was a sham? And he never did. Through the course of this show, you ended up, I think most of us ended up really siding with this one real guy trying to navigate all of this craziness. But the playfulness of what is jury duty? Why do so many people want to get out of jury duty? What does it mean to hold someone's fate in your hands in the jury room? What does it mean to be sequestered so you are not affected by news and media reports? And I think I just remember that show being a really playful examination of what one person's experience could be in a very constructed way.
Well, I would love to be able to do jury duty. Have not been chosen yet. Also, growing up, I, unlike these boys in Rome, did not really know any lawyers. I didn't have anyone in my family that I could watch or mimic. I was actually surprised in law school. A lot of people did have lawyers who were their parents or close relatives. Obviously, there is an array of TV shows that portrays lawyers, from Law and Order that's been mentioned to Scandal to Suits to, I mean, I could go on for a long time on that. But I want to talk about some more interactive experiences that I had and that I've known other people had playing lawyer that influenced them to become lawyers in real life. I think one of my first experiences was in high school, my freshman year. We read To Kill a Mockingbird, which was hugely influential. And we got to do monologues and actually take on the role of the lawyer. And I remember being so excited for that assignment and really preparing and looking at the unfairnesses in the case. Many high schools, even junior highs, have mock trial teams where there is a case that you have for the entire year, and every single school in the country, I believe, gets the same fact pattern, or in this, whatever the league is, and the teams prepare both sides, both prosecution and defense, and different students take on the role of lawyer, of defendant, of witness, of expert. They write briefs, and they actually use real case law. So they're getting the experience of relying on actual Supreme Court cases. I had the honor of coaching our mock trial team at Juvenile Hall in Orange County, and our students got to compete against other high schools in Orange County, including some really fancy high schools that have like paid coaches and, travel budgets and all of us, and all of that. Our students, it was really interesting because it's hard to keep a team together when the students that are doing really well sometimes get released from custody early and then can't be on the team. And the students that were maybe struggling got put on, restriction in custody so they couldn't compete. So you have to have this middle group of kids that are in custody for long enough to be able to make it through the season. But it was really cool because some of these kids had such talent, hidden talent of doing legal research, of making persuasive arguments. For many of them, and I think this is not unique to kids in juvenile hall, because I know for me, when I first had experiences with these kind of activities, I had never worn a suit before. One of my coworkers is really stylish and really great at just fashion clothing, and she took all the kids' measurements and was able to get them suits from, I think, like Macy's or something. So seeing those kids put on the clothes to be like a lawyer instead of wearing their juvie jail clothes. I had a client who testified at his own trial and did an excellent job. We got a not guilty, and I recruited him for the mock trial team, and he actually won a speaker award out of the whole county. And so it was kind of this weird, like, real life meets, meets play. But it was really cute. We worked together. I drew up flashcards for him. He memorized his cases. He memorized his points. I would go to juvenile hall and work with him on his arguments. We had practice with the whole team. And it was really, really neat. And I think for kids that do mock trial, it actually does give a pretty real sense of how trials work. I have an intern right now who's actually at a moot court competition in Texas. And the way that she is passionate about case law, making arguments that I probably wouldn't have even thought of. Really, really cool to see. Moot court, which is similar to mock trial, but it's on an appellate level. I did moot court in law school, where again, we were given a case and had to prepare an appellate argument. I had a sports law case, and I got to go to Tulane University, and we got to do some of our arguments in the Fifth Circuit courthouse. And different lawyers from the community played judges. That was my first time arguing in a courthouse. And when I became a real lawyer, I actually had a few Ninth Circuit appellate arguments. And I look back, and moot court was the thing that prepared me the most, more than any other class I had in law school for my real life argument. It was actually almost exactly the same. There's obviously things like speech and debate that teach you argumentation and kind of some of the soft skills of public speaking. I think those activities are invaluable whether or not you become a lawyer, because just to be comfortable speaking in front of a group of people, if you do become a lawyer, especially if you're a trial lawyer, public speaking becomes part of your job. And for people that have never had that experience, just the fact of public speaking can cause tremendous anxiety, and trials can be stressful on their own. And so to have had this experience starting at age high school or college, it just kind of alleviates some of that pressure and has skills that help you in real life. There's other types of mock law programs that I've learned about that I didn't do myself. One of them, I guess the YMCA has a youth in government mock legislature program where they actually compete in writing laws. Cal State Fullerton, and I think some of the other Cal States, and I'm sure other universities as well, have a legislative program where students who participate can write their own bills on any topic of their choice. And if they find an author in the California legislature to actually draft and take on their bill, they get certain prizes. The United Nations actually has a negotiation competition with part of like a summer institute where you're given a mock international global crisis and you have to work on negotiating outcomes. These things really are important for increasing access to legal careers. There's people that, like me, maybe don't know any lawyers, but by doing these activities, it becomes, in their minds, doable, achievable. If they see people that look like them, that have similar backgrounds to them, I think it can, I think people have so much hesitation of people going into legal careers that they don't think they're smart enough or don't think they'll be able to handle the reading. And so I think doing these things makes it seem like, oh, okay, it's not that scary. It takes away some of that intimidation factor. There's also activities that are kind of at the intersection of, quote, playing lawyer and real lawyering. So there's teen courts. This is a new movement where instead of sending kids all to juvenile hall for small infractions or small violations of the law, there's actually programs run by real judges that actually count as binding legal proceedings. But instead of kids going into court and being judged by a judge, there's a jury of their peer that decides if they are guilty, and then if they did break the law, what the punishment should be. So it might be writing a letter of apology. When I was, I worked at a law firm for a little bit, and I volunteered once, and we learned of this girl who had, I don't know if she had stolen something or done something, but she was pregnant, and her students, the punishment was to write a letter to her son, who she was Black, apologizing that that she made a choice that made this baby have to face incarceration before even being born and perpetuate, something along those lines. There's, parent involvement, things like that. There's also law school clinics, and those are clinics run by law professors who are licensed lawyers. They get real cases. They may practice, like when I did a law school clinic, we had a hypothetical case that we practiced on first, but then we also got to work on real cases with lawyers. But it's kind of like bowling with bumper lanes, because you have a supervisor that's watching you, but you actually get the experience of doing real law. In law school, we had negotiations and client meetings where the school actually hired actors or brought people from the acting school. I went to NYU Law School, so we had Tisch. And so I don't know how many of the actors were from there, but they would play clients. They would play defendants. They would play business people. And we actually got to practice doing some of those, again, softer skills of negotiating and meeting with clients. We would be videotapes. And then even law itself allows a lot of room for experimentation, for play. It's called practicing law for a reason. There are different conferences you can go to where you can learn creative ways to do opening and closing arguments. For example, doing a first person monologue where you actually narrate from your client's point of view. So the prosecutor will get up and say, the evidence will show that on this date, this person kidnapped, a child and took them away. Whereas the defense attorney can get up and say, I was terrified. I had just gone to collect my belongings from my ex-girlfriend's house. I wanted things to be peaceful. She started throwing my things on the street. She threatened to take my child away. She was violent. I saw that she had been drinking. She had custody, but my child wasn't safe with her. I just, things like, and then going into the narrative from their perspective, doing things like that. I've had coworkers that have played the guitar in closing arguments, or just done these new approaches that are kind of theatrical. And obviously you only do that if you think it's going to be effective with the jury, because you have a duty to provide effective assistance of counsel. But so much of our job is humanizing our client, getting the jury to see our client from a different perspective, and taking a kind of playful approach or taking calculated risks can break through to juries in ways that maybe just the traditional kind of boring robotic argument wouldn't. And so I think playing lawyer doesn't have to stop when you become a lawyer.
Fascinating. There's this little video game called Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. It's probably best known for being a GIF, as when this guy with hair in a Japanese style of video game is saying objection. And this game is really all about the law room, the courtroom, but with a flair for the dramatic, as this lawyer brings in like plenty of surprise witnesses or evidence at the last minute, because you basically get to play him as this lawyer, and you get to also investigate these cases. Even though, bringing in surprise evidence or surprise witnesses is not really allowed in the US courts, but it is allowed in this world of this game, which is like a mix between Japanese and American law. But I think it's funny that this lawyer does often, obstruct justice. He tampers with evidence. He snoops around crime scenes and then withholds evidence and then information. He basically bends the trial to fit his needs. And I think he's like portrayed as heroic and dramatic and just very exciting of a courtroom video game. And I think he even brings in like a pet parrot at one point to be like an animal witness, which apparently has happened before in a US trial. But yeah, this kind of dynamic between the lawyer versus prosecutor, like it is very, very high grounds for a dramatic kind of confrontation.
One of the end results of being in a trial, being put on trial, being found guilty, could be incarceration. And I remember a few ways that we were taught to think about being in jail, being incarcerated. When I was a kid, the first thing that I remembered was the London Bridge song and children's game, where you had people, you were London Bridge, and there were two people who were the bridge, and then other kids moved through the bridge. And at one point, you would sing, "Take the key and lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. Take the key and lock her up, my fair lady." And then, bam, that person, after you sang lady, they were in jail. They were locked up. Why it was London Bridge and not the Tower of London, I'm not sure. But somehow in London Bridge, this person got locked up. And it was, I remember being sort of caught, in between the arms of these people and feeling like, oh, I'm in a cell. I can't move now. And then eventually it would be kind of like, ha ha ha, and they would let you go. And then someone new would be locked up. But the idea of, okay, what does it mean to be locked up? There are lots of books, young adult novels that, for some reason, the characters end up in a prison cell. And what does that mean? Is it in a dungeon? Is it in a modern prison? That kind of thing. I remember the in jail space in Monopoly. There's a whole corner for whether you're in jail or you are just visiting. What did you do to get put in jail in Monopoly? You landed on the space and somehow, well, no, you were just visiting if you landed on the space, but there were certain cards or other, I think maybe there was a dice roll that would send you to jail. It was never really clear to me. But once you got, I think you had to roll doubles to get out of jail, and then you were just, someone buying land again. Prison didn't really have too much of an effect on you. In fact, there are people who, with Monopoly, are kind of like, well, no, the longer you stay in prison, the better it is for you, because then you are not landing on spaces that require you to pay rent. but
Hmm.
other people are landing on your space, and my goodness, do you collect rent when you are in jail? And I don't know. It was just kind of, what exactly are we learning? I'm not sure. Hockey had a penalty box. So if there was an infraction in hockey, you were stuck in the penalty box and you had to stay there until you could jump back in. There were a whole bunch of penal colonies in prison where you might be sent to like the salt mines on planet Osriar, and you'd have to dig up some salt or something like that. Lots and lots of science fiction. And then also many stories of prison breakouts. And I think I remember probably from D&D and other kinds of stories, probably fantasy. How would I break out of this prison cell? Computer games as well. You had to find the stone that was loose so you could get out, or you had to, like in the Shawshank Redemption, find a way into the sewer system or something like that. Countless stories about prison breaks and how you would evade the guards, how you would evade the spotlights. I don't know exactly why prison breakouts were such a thing with children's literature and young adult literature and then adult literature, but I suppose, or I don't know what the percentage of people is who are incarcerated at some point during their life, but the idea of if you are not incarcerated, thinking about what would it be like to be in prison, and if you were falsely accused, how would you get out? And what would you do while you were there? How would you survive? So that's kind of what I remember and what we're still sort of asked to play through today.
It's interesting you bring up Monopoly having a difference between visitors to jail and people actually sentenced to jail, because every time I visit clients in jail, I am reminded that I am at the mercy of the guards letting me out, because for that period of time, I am very much locked up. And there's so much I could talk about in regard to mass incarceration and the Innocence Project and what is justice, and is the only time we want to fight to decarcerate people when there's a wrongful conviction. Is innocence the only worthy cause? I could do a whole podcast on that, but I will stick to the topic of plain incarceration. I remember as a child, again, my Catholic school, all we had was an asphalt parking lot to play in. But once a year, we would have a little fiesta carnival where there would be little kind of wooden booths set up with like fishbowl. You toss a ping pong and you get the fishbowl. And they were all very, very simple games, nothing fancy. But there was a little jail that you could go in. And I remember thinking it was kind of fun, but also a little scary to hide in there and to be in there with the door shut. I also, on a more serious note, think of the Stanford prison experiment, which was in August of 1971. A professor at Stanford conducted a controversial psychological experiment where for 2 weeks, the plan was to simulate a prison environment that examined the effects of different variables on participants' reactions and behaviors. And certain students were assigned to be guards and certain students were assigned to be inmates. But after a psychologist came to look at what was happening with the experiment, she found that there was too much abuse by the volunteer mock guards, and actually the experiment had to stop because the harms were not being, they weren't mock harms anymore. They were actually causing real harms. And that gets into multiple levels, which is what are the ethics of doing experiments that involve incarceration, but then also what happens when some people are given power over others. And a lot of prisons are built in very rural areas, and there are many prisons where almost the entire town works at the prison because that is one of the only jobs that are there. And then the inmates are removed from any family and friends. It's tough, especially when you start getting into private prisons. And are we using incarceration really to rehabilitate, to deter? What is the justification for these? Is it just to punish? Is it retribution? You get into theories of punishment when you start looking at these at incarceration, and where does private prison and the creation of jobs fall into that? And is there a conflict of interest there? I think there is, probably, depending on the situation, not in every case, but it definitely opens it up to these questions that I think are important to ask. And as you mentioned, there's lots of stories about people being incarcerated, even in children's books, like Rapunzel being locked in a tower and this sense of needing rescue. Cinderella, even where it's not official prison, people kind of not being able to get out of their own circumstances. Romantasy books often involve people being jailed or interrogated. I'm reading Fourth Wing and its sequels right now, and there is a guard that does interrogation and things like that. There's also movies that look at incarceration and justice. The Green Mile was hugely impactful on me, where it kind of followed some of the inmates at a prison, and they were on death row, and the movie portrayed some horrific executions, and they did such a good job of making the inmates the protagonists and really seeing them as a complex whole, like I talked about before. And like the guards were actually really cruel. And when you look at what counts as crime, it's like the prison guards are actually, in their treatment of the prisoners, were engaging in more morally problematic behavior than arguably the inmates themselves. Shawshank Redemption, like you mentioned, Dead Man Walking. There's a lot of movies that really explore who deserves to be incarcerated, who is redeemable, what happens when somebody becomes redeemable partway through their prison sentence. In so many ways, incarceration equals erasure, like from society. You're just completely removed. And then on kind of a different note, I will also say that there are a number of my clients and other people on death row that would receive love letters, largely from women across the United States, but also in Europe. In Europe, they don't have the death penalty. And so there were organizations that actually would connect pen pals or people wanting to write to American death row inmates and give them pen pals. I had clients that wound up getting married. During this long period of time where I was single, I had clients that had a more active dating life than I did, even though they were on death row. And I think there's just this fascination by a lot of people about these men in prison. I mean, one, it's a captive audience, kind of. But also there is this kind of like draw, this fascination, this like, oh, maybe you're innocent and I can prove you innocent, or I see your humanity when nobody else does. There's probably a lot of different reasons why women tend or can be at times drawn to quote unquote bad boys. But it's definitely a thing. So that covered a lot of different grounds, but again, all of these subtopics I could probably talk about an hour or two each. Avery, you could take it from here.
Your mentioning of like romance plus incarceration has reminded me of BDSM dungeons. Lately, I've been listening to this podcast by Eva O. She is a dominatrix who basically just tells about all her experiences being a dominatrix and working in dungeons. And I think there very much is that theme of being trapped and being locked in somewhere, but this is a different take on it where pleasure or intimacy is like kind of at the forefront. And of course you have, in a medieval dungeon or, a fantasy dungeon, you usually think of like stone walls, metal chains, some torture devices and all that. And, BDSM dungeons also have their tools and devices too, just with different purposes, but still often with the ideas of bondage, of discipline, and then there's like the dominance or submission mechanics, like literally what all the letters stand for. But in kind of these more organized dungeons, there is an element of like privacy, but also structure. And going back to how we talked about rules and laws and such in BDSM and the practices related to it, there ideally is a lot of structure in place and safety in place so that those who wish to play within those dynamics are ultimately safe and are ultimately able to enjoy the fact that they're not actually going to get hurt or that they can stop at any time and that their consent is centered above all else. And all this structure and guidelines allow also for more free role playing for whatever they wish to enjoy. And also with like the theme of, you know, sexy cops and whatever, there is also always like that role play of, oh, I'm a big cop and you're just a lowly criminal, and like the themes of like degradation and like submission and all the other things that can go into that, is that the fantasy of that and the escape of that can be very possible in kind of a private secluded place, that, you know, what stays in the dungeon, or no, probably what happens in the dungeon stays in the dungeon. So there's that for you.
It kind of strikes me, going back to that London Bridge thing, how close the being trapped in the London Bridge dungeon when you were locked up and the arms went around you on both sides, how very close that was to a hug. You know, you are held in a space, and when you hug somebody, you are also holding them in a space, and you are holding a moment, and for a minute, I guess you could say you are, I don't want to say trapped, but you are surrounded, right? You are surrounded, and so maybe the line is kind of interesting. And famously, at the end of the musical Pippin, when Pippin has created a life, this sort of pastoral life, and he has like a wife and a stepkid now, I think it's the leading player says, "Well, Pippin, how are you feeling now?" And Pippin says, "Trapped, but happy," which isn't too bad for the end of a musical. So I don't know.
Yeah.
But one thing that we didn't quite get to was detective investigation. How do you go about solving a crime? We talked about Agatha Christie. We talked about a couple of things, but how do you track down evidence? And how do you make decisions? How do you solve a case? And how do you do that playfully if you are not an actual detective? Oh my goodness. There are so many shows about finding evidence. And I used to watch Columbo with my mom when I was a kid. I watched Murder, She Wrote when I was a kid. There was just a whole genre of how do you go about collecting evidence and solving a mystery or solving a case. And today there are escape rooms that are specifically focused on solving a murder mystery. There are box games. I just looked at a box game that's available sort of in big box stores, and it was about solving the case of a woman who was found in an island rehab center, and she was not one of the people who was there as part of the rehab experience. Where had she come from? Who took her life? And for what reason? Those questions, trying to figure out what kind of evidence do you need to solve this case. So there was witness testimony. They talked to everyone who was on the island. Crime scene photos, police reports, letters from character to character, other sort of actual evidence like necklaces or license plates on boats. And it was really interesting to think about, how do you put these pieces together? I think about Sherlock Holmes. So during the Victorian period in London, so Poe was writing some detective fiction, but probably Conan Doyle was the first person who was really successful. And I think, I'm going to put this forward, I think that Sherlock Holmes was such a successful character and series because for the first time, readers could try to put the clues together themselves and could challenge themselves to go up against Sherlock Holmes and see if they could figure out exactly why the person who slept in the room in the adventure of the Speckled Band would be found dead, and what the clues were that would reveal to Holmes that the important thing about the dog was that the dog did nothing in the nighttime, and that was the curious incident. And all of those things that began with I suppose, the job of detective really coming into play, Scotland Yard really becoming a thing in Victorian Britain, was that all of these crime stories started cropping up everywhere. The Jack the Ripper mysteries. People would read the newspaper and try to solve the mystery of who was the Ripper. How would they look at all the evidence that the papers were publishing? And did they have the right idea? Did they have something that no one else had figured out? So we go from that to present day. Rose, what do you think about solving true crime mysteries, being a detective?
Well, I think that this is a tremendously popular genre in many different media forms. Of course, podcasts have really taken off. I myself, even though I work in criminal law all day, almost every day, still would listen. My first podcast was Serial, which they went over kind of a cold case, and then that led to the case being reopened. Crime Junkie, my favorite murder, Up and Vanished, more, but there's so many true crime podcasts. And again, kind of that interesting, where does play end and real life detective begin? Because a lot of these podcasts have Facebook groups or Reddit threads where amateur sleuths are actually trying to help solve these murders, these cold cases, with sometimes success. There's also documentaries, including some cases from the 80s and 90s that I remember hearing about on TV as a kid. There's now the Lacey Peterson documentary. There's the Menendez brothers coming back. There's, John Benet Ramsey, I think. So many people are interested in this. I remember in 8th grade being at a friend's birthday party, and watching the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase. And O.J. Simpson trial was one of the first trials ever televised, where it was on mainstream TV. And I just remember hearing all the evidence and kind of trying to figure out, what really happened? Well, what did the officers not do? Or what was missing? Who was telling the truth? Who was lying? And it was kind of this sense of being a detective. And in fact, that trial was so big that in my 10th grade class, that's when the verdicts came out. I remember I was in the middle of chemistry, and there was an announcement that the jurors had reached a verdict, and the teacher stopped class and rolled in the TV, and we actually all watched the verdict being read, which is just so funny to think about. I think there's a lot of reasons why people are so into true crime and wanting to play detective. I think it can give this sense of safety. Like, well, if I'm clever enough, then I'd be able to prevent this from happening to me. I think there is something about engaging with a topic that's really scary, but from a distance, just like with horror movies or going on scary rides. It gives you a sense of control over it. I think there's a sense of justice and resolution, of wanting the bad guy to get their due. There's been lots of psychologists that have written about this phenomenon. And then I think for people in the industry, sometimes it can be a little bit cathartic to listen to other cases. There's actually a podcast called Another Not Guilty, and it's done by an LA County public defender, and he has lawyers come on and tell about their trials and their not guilty verdicts. And that also involves detective work, because as a defense attorney, you're given what the police officers did, what their investigation was, what their investigation led to. But there's also other ways the investigation could have gone. And part of our job is to reinvestigate crimes and see if they got anything wrong. So yeah, there's lots of reasons I think people are drawn to true crime and wanting to be detectives. Yeah. Avery.
Yeah. I've seen so much about true crime that I feel like if I was put into any random person's room, I would be able to divulge a lot about their lives, and I'm pretty proud of that. But it's also like being observant as well, and also kind of sneaky and ready to look for what humans normally do in their lives. And my sister and I, growing up, would often secretly read each other's diaries when we got the chance. I especially would, if there was like some drama going on between her and my parents, I'd be like, oh, okay, I wonder why they're arguing so much. Let me just read and see. So that was a pretty fun, interesting way to secretly get to know each other without each other's consent. I also recently played a escape room. It was run by my university's psychology department, and it was a psychology experiments gone wrong kind of theme. And the premise was that the journalism student was like, "Hey, there's this room 154 in the psychology building that's containing some secrets and we need your help with investigating it." And we basically had several different rooms that each illustrated different psychology experiments. One was like the stranger experiment, another was like the it was like an electroconvulsive kind of experiment where they would experiment with how much a person would electrocute somebody at just because they were being told to, which was an experiment that kind of came out of World War II and investigating why the Nazis would just kind of blindly follow their leaders' orders and such like that. So that was a interesting experience because we also got to watch like videos, we got to see the actual devices that were used for those, and we got to also learn more about psychology, and we were able to kind of it's honestly fun going through somebody else's stuff. And going through somebody else's personal stuff is so fun. I think that's a huge reason why the crime solving escape rooms are so just fun, because like you're not supposed to, but once you do, you learn so much about something. And I don't know, and you also eventually get the closure for the crime that you're solving as well. And I mean, hey, you're also practicing your observation skills, your critical thinking. I think it's great that we're training the next generation of crime solving experts in our local entertainment communities.
So at the end of all this, I am trying to figure out what does all this mean and how do we play through these things? How does it mean something in a larger context as well? I'm going to read a quote from the play The Sultan's Dilemma, which is essentially about in order to solve a dilemma that he has, should the Sultan kill somebody or should he submit to the law? If he kills somebody, then he is not going to have the law determine his fate, but he will also have killed someone, and that will affect how the people see him. This was written in a period where Egypt was trying to determine what kind of a modern Arab nation they would be. So here's the quote. This is actually the chief judge telling the Sultan what he thinks he should do. I recognize the undoubted strength possessed by the sword, its swift action and decisive effect. But the sword gives right to the strongest, and who knows who will be the strongest tomorrow. There may appear some strong person who will tilt the balance of power against you. As for the law, it protects your rights from every aggression because it does not recognize the strongest, it recognizes right. And now there's nothing for you to do, your majesty, but choose between the sword which imposes and yet exposes you, and between the law which threatens and yet protects you. Okay, so this is playfully the playwright trying to work out what does it mean to be a leader? What does it mean to have a government? And what kinds of power should that government have? I think the playwright Al-Hakim also recognized that submission to the law, just as with submission to Allah and the laws of Islam, protected the populace of Egypt from might making right, and asked that the government start with the rights of the people. Because if the people were submitting to an authority, then the authority should have the rights of the people first and foremost in their mind. So there's a little playful example of a script that had real world implications in trying to figure out what was a government going to look like.
So why does this all matter? My answer begins with exploring laws, why we have laws, how we play laws, helps us answer questions like, what does it mean to be a human in society? How much freedom are we willing to give up to adhere to our social contracts? And what happens when we can't opt out of the social contract and yet we don't agree with the laws? It helps answer questions like, how do our laws reflect our cultural values and not just our good values? I think in general, law, the attempt to regulate human behavior, involves the extremes of humanity, some of the best of humanity, some of the sacrifices we're willing to make for those we love, and to have a peaceful, unified social place to live. But it also explores fear and desire, interdependence, justice and mercy, freedom and safety. There's all of these values that come into clashing conflict when we start looking at the law. And engagement with the law doesn't always look like following the law. We see civil rights protests. We want accountability for our lawmakers. We try to speak truth to power, and law isn't the only means of doing that. Like you mentioned, there are plays, there are artwork, there is science. There's so many different industries and different careers that intersect with the law and can engage with the law by challenging it. I love the idea of dissent. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a famous quote, "Dissents speak to a future age." She would write really powerful, well thought out, well argued dissents, even though in that moment they were not going to be the law. They were not the majority decision, but she wrote to a future age. And in a playful manner, she would wear a collar that looked like armor. She would wear kind of like a necklace kind of thing on top of her robe whenever she was going to dissent. And that was a playful way of addressing dissent. I also really like the quote by Howard Zinn, "Dissent is the highest form of patriotism." And if we don't know what the laws are, if we don't know how we arrived at our current state of the laws, we won't know when certain laws need to be challenged. We don't know when we should submit and when we should resist. And so I think playing law and examining the law is super important to the future of our democracy.
Absolutely. And I was in Model United Nations during high school for 2 years, and I grew so much from that experience. And it forced me to really go out of my shell, to give speeches, whether it be 5 minutes long, 10 minutes long, 2 minutes long, or even 30-second long little speeches that I have to come up with on the spot to talk about international conflicts such as human trafficking, organized crime, health epidemic, genocides, other international conflicts, everything, and writing essays on my country's policies toward the issue. Regardless of which country I was assigned to, I had to do so much research and understand where each country was kind of coming from. And all the preparation and research that goes into that was a big part of why I was able to learn that, you know, law and its international components are so important to practice and to play at, especially at a young age like I was in high school. as when you grow up and having had these experiences of being able to play around with it and see what you can do and what you can advocate for eventually gives way to actual strength and courage to fight for what you need to fight for in the future as an adult. Thank you so much, Rose, for joining us on this very special episode of Powered by Play.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been Powered by Play with Avery and Drew. If you've been enjoying this podcast, you can support us online at Ko-fi. That is ko-fi.com/poweredbyplay. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.